The first thing I saw when I walked into the bathroom that morning wasn't the damp towel on the floor or the half-empty bottle of shampoo. It was her wedding ring, sitting in the soap dish like it had been abandoned in a rush. It was still wet. She was supposed to be 3 states away, halfway through her girls' getaway weekend. I'd even helped load her suitcase into the Uber 2 nights ago. So why would her ring be here, in our house, when she was, well, supposedly sipping mimosas on a beach somewhere? I stood there, toothbrush in my hand, staring at that ring like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. Part of me wanted to believe it was some innocent mix-up. Maybe she'd taken it off before leaving and forgotten to bring it. But that didn't make sense. She's the kind of person who checks her purse twice before walking out the door. My phone buzzed. A picture popped up in our group chat from one of her friends. All of them dressed to kill at some rooftop bar, glasses raised, city lights behind them. And there she was, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world, her left hand wrapped around a stemmed glass. No ring. No faint tan line. Nothing. I almost dropped my phone. Not because she wasn't wearing it, but because behind her, blurred but unmistakable, was the reflection in the bar's glass wall. A tall man, leaning in close to her, his face just out of frame, but his hand was on her hip. And then I remembered something. She never actually told me the name of the hotel they were staying at. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to sit at home and wait for her to come back. No, I was going to make a move she would never expect. I didn't grab my keys right away. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, still staring at that ring in the soap dish like it was mocking me. I could almost hear her voice in my head, saying, "You're overthinking again, Vern." But the image of that blurred man in the bar's reflection wouldn't leave my mind. The way his hand rested on her hip wasn't casual. It was the kind of touch you don't give someone unless you think you're allowed to. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, trying to calm down. The steam curled up into my face, but it didn't help. Every sip tasted bitter, like it was steeped in the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I thought about texting her again, something sharp, like, "Who's your new friend?" But no, that would be too easy for her to deflect. If she was hiding something, she'd just have a prepared excuse ready. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up her Instagram. She hadn't posted anything new, but her friends had. A beach boomerang of them running into the surf, a brunch video of mimosas clinking, and then, buried in the feed, a tag post from someone I didn't recognize. It was another rooftop shot, but this one wasn't staged for the group. It was candid, and in it, Lila was turned toward that same guy from the reflection. His face was still half obscured by motion blur, but I could see enough to know he was smiling down at her like they were sharing a private joke. That's when I made up my mind. I was done sitting in my kitchen, pretending I could figure this out through phone screens and social media sleuthing. If she was lying about where she was, or who she was with, I was going to find out in person. And I wasn't going to give her a single clue that I was coming. I booked a last-minute flight to Charleston, leaving in 5 hours. No checked luggage, just a carry-on with a change of clothes, my phone charger, and the one thing I knew would rattle her if she saw it, the ring from the soap dish. I slipped it into a tiny velvet pouch and zipped it into my jacket pocket. If she really was just having an innocent weekend with friends, I'd look like a paranoid fool. But if my gut was right, then that ring was going to be the centerpiece of a conversation she'd never forget. The plane touched down in Charleston just after sunset, the sky still streaked with a dying orange glow that seemed almost too peaceful for what I was about to do. I didn't check my phone right away. I didn't want her to see that little active dot next to my name and start asking questions. Instead, I walked straight past the baggage claim, out into the humid evening air, and called a rideshare. My driver was a talkative guy named Benny who kept pointing out landmarks, but I wasn't really listening. I had my own mission in mind. Before I'd even boarded the flight, I'd spent a solid hour piecing together where they might be staying. It wasn't easy. Lila had been careful not to tag any locations herself, but her friend Jenna hadn't been as cautious. In one of her brunch photos, there was a mirror in the background that clearly reflected a sign from the street. I zoomed in, Googled the name, and there it was, a boutique hotel just a few blocks from the waterfront. Benny dropped me off 2 streets over from the place. I didn't want to be obvious, in case she or any of her friends happened to be in the lobby. I walked the rest of the way, blending into the evening crowd, my jacket zipped just enough to hide the outline of the velvet pouch in my pocket. The hotel was everything you'd expect from a Charleston getaway spot. white columns, hanging ferns, soft golden lights spilling onto the sidewalk. I slipped inside like I belonged there and headed straight for the bar off the lobby. That's when I saw her. She was at a corner table with two of her friends, laughing like she didn't have a single care in the world. And across from her, leaning back in his chair with that same easy confidence I'd seen in the photos, was the man from the rooftop. Up close, he looked older than I'd imagined, maybe late 30s, clean-shaven, with a sharp jawline and the kind of tan that said, "I spend my free time on a boat." His hand wasn't on her now, but his eyes never left her when she spoke. I slid onto a stool at the far end of the bar, close enough to keep them in sight, but far enough not to be noticed. The bartender asked if I wanted a drink, and I ordered something I didn't even hear myself say, my eyes locked on that table. I was trying to read her body language. Was she leaning toward him just a fraction too much? Were her smiles a little too soft? Or was I seeing what I wanted to see? Then, just as I started to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted, she reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and tilted the screen toward him. He leaned in, their heads almost touching, and whatever she showed him made them both laugh in that quiet, conspiratorial way that makes you feel like the rest of the world isn't even there. That was it for me. I slid my hand into my pocket, felt the cool metal of the ring inside the pouch, and decided I wasn't going to just sit there and watch this play out from the sidelines. Tonight, she was going to see me. I didn't walk straight over to her table. That would have been too easy, too obvious. Instead, I waited until she and her friends were deep in conversation, that sweet spot where people stop glancing around the room and start letting their guard down. I took a slow sip of my drink, set it down, and then casually slid off my stool, moving toward the lobby as if I was just passing through. But halfway there, I turned toward the hallway that led to the hotel's restrooms. I didn't need to use them. What I needed was to see where the group's rooms were. The layout of the hotel was old-school Charleston, narrow halls, creaky floorboards, doors painted a crisp white. I walked slowly, scanning for anything that might tell me where they were staying. Then I got lucky. One of Lila's friends, not one she was with at the table, but another from the trip, stepped out of her room at the end of the hall, phone to her ear. She didn't notice me. As soon as she disappeared around the corner, I strolled past and glanced at the number, 214. I didn't know if it was Lila's room or just part of their block, but it didn't matter. Now I had a base to work from. I went back down to the bar, ordered another drink, and took my original seat. They were still there, still laughing, still leaning in too close for my liking. The guy had that relaxed posture of someone who knows he's being noticed, one arm draped over the back of his chair, legs stretched out like he owned the place. And Lila, she looked different. Not just in her clothes or her makeup, but in the way she carried herself. Confident. Electric. Like she'd stepped out of the version of herself I knew and into something entirely new. I had to remind myself why I was here. The plan wasn't to storm in and cause a scene. Not yet. I wanted the moment to land like a punch she never saw coming. So I waited until the bartender brought the check to their table. She reached for her purse. The guy waved her off with a charming little smirk, and they all stood to leave. I stayed seated, pretending to scroll on my phone, tracking them in my peripheral vision as they crossed the lobby toward the elevators. The second the elevator doors closed behind them, I moved. I slipped out of the bar, into the hall, and hit the stairs two at a time. If they were going to the second floor, I could beat them there. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I reached the landing, turned the corner, and there it was, the sound of their voices, getting louder. I stepped into the shadowed alcove next to room 214, pulled the velvet pouch from my pocket, and held the ring loosely in my palm. My plan was simple. When she saw me standing there, holding it, she'd know exactly why I was in Charleston and exactly what I'd seen. But when the elevator dinged and the group stepped out, something unexpected happened. She wasn't with them. The man was. And he was alone. For a second, I thought I'd miscalculated completely. The man stepped out of the elevator alone, his easy swagger replaced with something sharper, more deliberate. He looked left, then right, scanning the hallway like he was making sure no one was watching. I stayed perfectly still in the alcove beside 214, the shadows swallowing me whole, my breath shallow enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. He didn't see me. He moved down the hall past my hiding spot, his shoes whispering against the old carpet. I noticed something. He had a hotel keycard in his hand, but it wasn't the standard blue one I'd seen at check-in. This one was black, with a thin gold stripe. He stopped outside a room halfway down the hall, glanced over his shoulder once more, and slid the card into the door. The lock clicked open with a muted green light, and he disappeared inside without turning on the overheads. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then I stepped out of the alcove and started down the hall, slow and silent, my sneakers barely making a sound. I passed 214, no noise inside, and kept going until I was outside the room he'd entered. The door had just enough gap at the bottom for a strip of light to spill out, warm and flickering. Not the kind of light you get from a lamp. Candlelight, maybe? That's when I heard it. Not voices, not exactly. More like the sound of someone moving, slow and deliberate, mixed with the faintest hum of music. I couldn't make out the song, but it was low, sultry, the kind of thing that didn't belong on a girl's weekend playlist. My fingers tightened around the velvet pouch in my pocket, the weight of the ring suddenly heavier than it had been all night. I had 2 options, knock or wait. If I knocked and she was in there, the shock would be instant, but it would also end the element of control I still had. If I waited, I risked losing her trail entirely, but maybe I'd see something that would erase all doubt. I chose to wait. It felt like an hour, but it was probably only 2 or 3 minutes before the door cracked open. A sliver of the room came into view, a corner of a bed, the curve of a wine glass on the nightstand, a pair of high heels lying carelessly on the floor. And then, a shadow crossed the light, and I heard laughter. Her laughter, the kind that starts low and bubbles up before she can stop it. I stepped back, my spine pressing against the wall, heart pounding so hard I thought it might echo down the hall. The man's silhouette moved into the doorway, blocking most of my view, but not enough to hide the fact that a second figure was standing just inside. She leaned toward him, close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of her hair under the flickering light. It was Lila. I didn't wait for them to see me. I turned and walked away, my mind already building the next move. If she thought this was some secret, she had no idea what was about to happen next. I didn't go straight back to my hotel. I walked right past the lobby, past the valet stand, and into the thick Charleston night, the air heavy with salt and the faint scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. My head was buzzing, not from the drinks. I'd barely touched them, but from what I'd just seen. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, pound on that door, and drag the truth out into the open. But something told me that would give her exactly what she wanted, the chance to spin it. She'd say it was innocent, that I'd misread everything, that I was paranoid. And without proof, I'd be standing there with nothing but my own shaky word against hers. So instead, I decided to get proof. There was a 24-hour diner just 2 blocks away. I slid into a booth in the back and ordered a coffee I didn't need, pulling my phone from my pocket. I still had a mutual follow with Jenna, the same friend who'd accidentally given away the hotel location earlier. Her Instagram stories were still live, and I went through them frame by frame, screenshotting anything that showed the man in the background. There were more than I'd realized. The beach, the bar, even walking down a crowded street with Lila at his side, their heads tilted toward each other like they were sharing secrets. That wasn't enough. I needed context, timestamps, something undeniable. I searched the photo's metadata. It wasn't exact. Stories strip a lot of that info, but I could still see when they'd been posted. The rooftop shots matched the exact time she'd told me she was heading to bed early because she was tired. The beach walk had been during the window when she claimed she was at the spa. Layer by layer, her whole weekend was unraveling in front of me. Then I remembered something in my jacket pocket that I'd almost forgotten about. The tiny keychain camera I'd bought months ago for a DIY home security project I never finished. It was the size of a car remote and completely silent. On a whim, I'd thrown it into my carry-on before leaving home, thinking I'd never use it. Now it felt like it had been waiting for this moment. I paid for my coffee, left a tip big enough to keep the waitress from remembering my face too clearly, and walked back toward the hotel. The plan was simple. I'd plant the camera in the hallway outside his door. The mic might not catch much, but if she came out in the morning, same clothes, messy hair, anything that tied her to that room, I'd have the visual proof no excuse could wipe away. When I reached the second floor again, the hall was empty. I took the camera from my pocket, pressed the tiny record button, and set it low on the ornate molding across from the room. It blended into the shadows perfectly, just another unnoticeable detail in a building full of them. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard something that made me stop. Laughter again. Hers, bright and unguarded, and then a voice. His, too low to make out the words, but not low enough to hide the warmth in it. It was the kind of voice you only use when you think no one else is listening. I didn't sleep that night. I booked a last-minute room at a budget motel across town instead of staying anywhere near her. The mattress felt like a sack of gravel. The air conditioning rattled like it was about to fall out of the wall, but I just lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that narrow gap under the hotel room door, the flicker of warm light, the curve of her silhouette leaning toward him. My hand kept finding its way to the velvet pouch in my jacket, rubbing the ring between my fingers until my skin felt raw. At first light, I was back at the boutique hotel. The desk clerk barely looked at me as I walked past. One of the perks of a place that catered to tourists coming and going at all hours. I climbed the stairs slowly, listening for movement. The hallway was silent. The black and gold keycard guy's door was still closed. My camera was exactly where I'd left it, its tiny red light blinking just enough for me to know it had been recording the whole night. I slipped it into my pocket and left without lingering. Back at the motel, I plugged it into my laptop and waited for the files to load. My stomach tightened when I saw there were multiple clips. The camera had been triggered several times overnight. I clicked the first one. At 2:14 a.m., the door opened. He stepped out first, wearing the same shirt from the bar, but with the sleeves rolled up, like he'd thrown it back on quickly. Lila appeared a moment later, barefoot, her hair loose and falling around her shoulders. She was laughing about something, covering her mouth with one hand, her other hand resting on his arm like it belonged there. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, speaking too softly for the mic to catch. Then she leaned in and kissed him. Not a quick peck, not the kind of thing you could pass off as friendly. It was slow, unhurried, the kind of kiss that makes time stop. The second clip showed them returning to the room around 4:30 a.m., her head resting against his shoulder as he unlocked the door. In the third, just after 9 a.m., she came out alone, hair damp from a shower, wearing the same red dress from the night before. She looked around the hall like she was checking if the coast was clear, then padded quickly toward the elevators, clutching her heels in one hand. I sat there staring at the screen long after the last clip ended. It wasn't just proof, it was a gut punch I could replay from 3 different angles. Every excuse she might try to feed me would choke on this. But instead of feeling satisfied, I felt something colder creeping in. This wasn't just about catching her anymore. It was about control, deciding when and how to use what I had, and making sure the moment landed in a way she would never forget. So I zipped the footage onto a flash drive, slid it into the same pouch as her ring, and started planning exactly where I was going to give both back to her. I didn't storm into the hotel or make a scene in front of strangers. I waited until she came home. She had no idea I'd been in Charleston, no clue I'd seen everything. When she walked through our front door that Sunday evening, dragging her suitcase behind her, she looked tired but lighter somehow. She smiled when she saw me, but I could tell there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Hesitation. I didn't speak right away. I just placed the velvet pouch on the kitchen table between us and slid it across. She frowned, opened it, and her breath caught when she saw her wedding ring inside. For a second, I could see her trying to piece together how it had gotten there. I found it, I said, and I found a few other things too. Her hands tightened on the pouch, and I could see the panic start to rise. But before she could start spinning a story, I pulled out the flash drive and set it beside the ring. This is yours too, I told her. It's everything from the weekend. You can watch it if you want, but I think you already know what's on it. She just stood there, staring at me, until finally she sank into the chair. And then, in a way I didn't expect, she didn't deny it, didn't deflect, she broke. The words poured out, messy and raw. She told me how the trip had started fine, but somewhere along the way she'd felt herself drifting into something dangerous, something she knew was wrong. She said it wasn't what it looked like, but admitted she'd crossed lines that should never have been crossed. I didn't yell. I just listened. For hours, we sat at that table, everything spilling out, not just about the weekend, but about the cracks we'd both ignored for years. There were apologies, there were tears, and there were long silences where we just let the weight of it settle between us. By the time the sun started to rise through our kitchen window, the flash drive was still sitting there, untouched. She slid it back toward me. "Delete it," she said softly. "Please." And I did. Not because I was letting her off easy, but because we decided together that we wanted to try again, really try. Counseling, honesty, no more blind trust without proof. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I booked that flight to Charleston, but maybe it was the one we both needed. I put the ring back on her finger myself, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a symbol of what we'd lost. It felt like a promise to build something better. It's going to be a long road, but for the first time in weeks, I believe we might actually make it.